Well, we're back, folks. We're doing another installment on our food safety and canning and home preserving series. You're watching BrainStormAcres. I'm Henry.
And I'm Irene.
And we're going to talk about something...
Cooties!
You like cooties, don't you?
Well, depends on who I get them from.
We'll also be talking about how you can actually preserve food. In addition to canning, you can dry it.
Right.
You can freeze it.
Mm-hmm. You can freeze dry it.
You can freeze dry it. You can... Let me check at my notes. You can smoke it. You can cool it. You can cook it. You can salt it. You can sugar it. You can basically cure it.
Right, right. But there's a couple of basic things that we'll be talking about that all of those things have some portion of in common. There's three things that control the safety of your food. Well, couple of things. Heat, cold, acid, and what they call water activity. Now, water activity sounds weird, and we'll talk about that later, because for most of us in the home environment, it's heat and cold that we use most of the time. And water activity, if you're dehydrating, is an issue. But we'll start with the heat and cold part.
Now, there's one other way of controlling food safety, and that's to use lye, believe it or not.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Because
that's a pH thing.
It is. So when we talk about using acid, like vinegar, that's to lower the pH. We try to lower the pH below 4.6.
Right, because the cooties don't like that.
Yeah, we'll go into more details about that. But the other way is to go high.
Really high.
So you can use lye. Now think about it. If you've ever eaten certain kinds of olives,
Yeah,
they've been cured with lye.
They've been cured with lye.
How about hominy? Those of you who live in the South or like hominy grits, you eat
They're
corn.
soaked in lye.
You've been eating corn that's been treated with lye.
Yep.
Well, cooties fall into a bunch of different categories. There's molds, there's yeast, and there's bacteria. Those are the three large groups that we're going to talk about.
Right, and not all of any of these are evil. They're very useful. We would have very boring bread if we didn't have yeast. We wouldn't have any fermented pickles if we didn't have yeast and some bacteria. There would be no yogurt if we didn't have bacteria. There would be no cultured butter if we didn't have bacteria. There'd be no cheese if we didn't have...
You're making the future sound very, very boring if we don't have those things.
That's true. We need both mold and bacteria for...
Oh, blue cheese.
Yeah. There's more than one, actually, cheese that uses mold. But yes, it would be very boring without that.
Now, as a brewer, and I've been a very long time brewer, one of the things that I can tell you is that when you ferment things, which when you make beer or wine, you ferment, but if you make a fermented pickle or sauerkraut, it's really a horse race between the good cooties.
And the bad cooties.
I like the good cooties.
Yeah, me too.
So the good cooties create a lactobacillus environment.
Right.
That is to make lactic acid.
Right.
And that's what really preserves the food that you're busy preserving.
Right. Remember in the last episode of this, we were talking about the fact that one of the ways you can control the safety of your food is by the acid level. So the lactobacillus is actually creating the acid for you. You don't have to add vinegar.
Now, one of the things that happens when you ferment is that, especially when you're fermenting a vegetable of any kind, there's always natural yeast and bacteria and mold on the produce. You can't really scrub it off. There's no point. You want to just rinse it off. Somebody wants you, Irene.
I think that's just news. Yeah, that's just news.
You know what I say?
Huh?
No news is good news.
Yes, right now it is.
In any case, a lot of times when you ferment vegetables, you'll see some scum that arises at the top of the liquid. When you make sauerkraut, the way you deal with that is you check the sauerkraut every single day and you skim off the scum that's on the top of the brine. That takes the mold or a bunch of the mold out of the process. Now that's important because a lot of molds can increase the pH of the fermentation, and that's bad.
Right.
That means those bad cooties can come and get you, or
Yeah.
at least get your vegetables.
Right. And we've often used the natural yeast on the outside of fruits when we've brewed. We used to be able to get fresh pressed apple juice from a farm in California. Organic apples, not sprayed, squish it, juice, and that had yeast built in. If you if you were silly enough to not refrigerate a jug of that and left it on the counter, it would probably explode in about 4 days because the pressure would build up in there. But you could make really, really, really good hard cider with that because you were using the natural yeasts that were there. That particular farm had good yeast.
Now, if you remember in the last episode, we were talking about food safety and how these things all work together. Well, in fermentation, when the vegetables are done being fermented, you need to store them in a cool place.
Right.
Because the fermentation is going to continue. The problem is if you have some mold that creeps in there, the acidity will come back, the pH will come back up.
The acidity will drop.
And that means that you may have an unsafe food situation.
Right.
So, generally speaking, you can keep fermented vegetables in the refrigerator for 4 to 6 months, but after that, they lose a lot of good quality. So the people who tell you, the people who tell you, oh, you just store the jars in the cupboard and you can eat it a year later.
Now, I will tell you the one kind of thing that you can do that with. Your fruit will not be whole and firm and everything else, but you can do it with a rumtopf. Now, a rumtopf is when you take alcohol, usually brandy, or some other high alcohol content, and you stick your fruit in there. You wash it off, you cut it, make sure there's no rotten spots on it or anything, you toss it in there. What you're doing there is you're preserving the fruit with the alcohol. Now, the alcohol becomes delicious to drink. It becomes a fruit brandy. The fruit is quite edible for months and months and months. At some point, it will get squishy.
Right.
So it'll have no texture, and sometimes if you leave it long enough, not much form either. But it's never going to be toxic because that alcohol is so strong that pretty much nothing can live in it. But regular that's not a normal fermentation. That's a preservation by alcohol.
Pickling by alcohol.
Pickling by alcohol, yeah. But your regular stuff, after a while, like I make Henry fresh pickles, and they're good in the fridge for
a week or two, depending on the type of pickle.
Yeah. And if I were to do the fermented ones, they'd probably be good for a month or more. But after a point, they lose their texture. And to me, part of the reason of going through the hassle of creating a fresh pickle is you want that texture.
Now, the really great thing about fermented products is that if it smells bad, plan that it is bad.
Yeah. And I don't mean, and that's a tough thing for people who are new to this. I don't like pickles.
I like pickles.
He loves pickles. But I could smell something and say, you're not going to want to taste that. I had some yogurt the other day that had some mold on the top. I scooped it off, and I tasted a half an inch down. And I said, I can still taste it. So I scooped off another half an inch, and I tasted again, all with clean spoons each time.
Well, that's one thing. When you're talking about food safety, cleanliness
is above godliness.
Really is. So
yes.
if you ever watched people go in and use a spoon to taste something, and then
I have seen some chefs give their workers bloody you-know-what for that one. You do not taste gravy that you're going to put on a customer's plate and then go back in with the same spoon. You use a clean spoon each time. Now, around the house, I'll taste the gravy that Henry will hand me a spoon and say, taste this. And we use that. It's our germs. We're just sharing.
And it's something that we're going to eat right away.
Immediately. But when I am making things like my yogurt, I'm super conscious of the fact that the containers are clean, everything I touch is clean, my hands are washed continuously, and I can make a quart or more of yogurt and have it last for 5 or 6 weeks in the fridge in a clean container. You do need a taste, a good sense of taste. That can be a problem for smokers, let me be blunt. Some smokers do not have much of a sense of taste left. And there's also a decrease in the ability to taste for some people as they get older. So, you have to be aware of that. You have to be honest with yourself. Can I really taste this? If I can't differentiate between that and this, then I just need to play on the side of caution and say it's trash.
So you can go ferment a lot of different things. And most of the time, as long as it doesn't smell bad,
right,
it'll be all right. But there's things you want to look for. If you see ropey masses in your ferment,
yes,
it kind of looks like a gelatinous string or
yeah.
glop.
It looks like something from a Star Trek movie gone awry, like a bad sci-fi sort of effect where you've got some sort of swirly, gooey stuff in there. Yeah, that's trash.
Yeah, don't eat it.
That's a colony is what it is.
It is.
That's a bacterial colony.
So I recommend don't eat.
No, don't eat things like that. There are some truly wonderfully horrible recipes out of the Middle Ages on what to do if your beer gets ropey. Now, I have an answer to that. You pour it down the drain. But they had ways that you could supposedly salvage it, and none of which I would accept as biologically sound. But, oh.
So again, keep in mind that fermentation is a great way to preserve food. It does have a limited shelf life. You really want to keep it cool. If you can't keep it in your refrigerator, at least keep it in a cellar, 50 or 55 degrees, something like that.
Right.
The warmer the temperature, the faster the food's going to degrade.
Right. In some cases, especially if you've made fresh pickles, you're dealing with the enzyme issue too. The enzymes have never been killed off there or stopped, so they're continuing to degrade the food. And then you add to that the natural process of basically the bacteria that's in there is still eating the food.
So, when all is said and done, if you're using fermentation for any reason, cleanliness is really essential.
Yeah, super, super important. I view cleanliness as important with any type of preservation. And most of the books that are serious about, they're not what, Henry and I have this term, bougie bougie. A bougie bougie book is one that is cool and a fad and may have some viability in terms of the things you're doing. It might make something that tastes good, but it may not be good for you in the long run. And science is a good thing when it comes to this sort of thing. So
when it comes to food preservation, science really is your friend.
Science is king when it comes to this.
Now, I'll give you one small anecdote and tell you why it works and why we would never do it.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of YouTube channels that I watch that are really entertaining. There's an Italian grandmother who does a lot of great canning,
mm-hmm.
but I would never use her techniques. She cans tomatoes, or tomato sauce in particular, in jars with lids, just the same way as we would.
Mm-hmm.
The only difference is she doesn't put it in a water bath.
She doesn't water bath it. She doesn't steam can it. She counts on the sheer volume of hot food she has, which she has put under a blanket to finish the canning. Now, I will bet if you did, there's a new form of canning that is approved. And it's, what do they call it? Low temperature
pasteurization.
Low temperature pasteurization. It allows you to use a lower temperature and still get safe product. But it requires very precise temperature control, which is, I won't say beyond the average canner. It's not beyond the average canner if you have an accurately thermostated electric canner. But I would say you can't do it safely if you're trying to use a water bath or a pressure canner.
So one of the things to keep in mind about Grandma's recipes is that sometimes Grandma's recipes work and are safe, because of the kind of tomato or the kind of vegetable that she was
Right.
busy canning.
And her environment.
And her environment.
You know, we talked about the fact that back when Louis Pasteur was running around, a bunch of the cooties that we have running around now that can kill people didn't exist.
Or they were, at least they weren't as virulent as they are
Right.
today.
Well, they were a different subgenus or whatever.
Subspecies.
Subspecies. They had E. coli, they had salmonella, they had all these things. In fact, they've actually been able to scientifically trace this stuff back genetically now.
Right.
To way earlier than they thought some of this stuff existed. But it wasn't as virulent a form as we have now. It wasn't as dangerous a form. Maybe it gave you a tummy ache instead of putting you flat on your back in an emergency room.
So mean cooties.
Mean cooties. A lot of the tomatoes, back when Grandma was doing her tomato sauce, were way more acid. You'll hear people modernly complain about, oh, I don't like acid tomatoes. So the growers, in their infinite wisdom of wanting to please the consumer, created tomatoes that are less acid. And I actually know people who can't eat acid things for medical reasons. So, okay, great for them, but not for keeping away cooties that, that don't like acid.
The moral of that story is that you have to be aware of a lot of things.
Right.
It's safest to use the established, documented, proven techniques.
Right.
A lot of that will help avoid all manner of food poisoning.
Right. It's just not worth it. The whole point of spending the time and effort to grow your own vegetables and then preserve them is to have safe, non-contaminated food for your family. So why would you want to poison them by being careless because you let cooties get in there?
Well, I hope you enjoyed this. It's time to say goodnight, Irene.
Good night, Irene.
Thanks for watching. We'll talk with you later. Bye.
Bye.